So if you're trying to make sense of AI for your business, you're in the right place. Welcome back to the latest episode of Unlocking AI Value. And today we're talking about building a culture of value. So Jay, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, sure. I think this is apropos conversation today. I think AI is highlighting this, but many of us have been talking about this for it seems like eons about, how important it is to measure value and determine based on prioritization of value of what you should invest in and work on, right? And I think with AI, we're seeing some of the same concerns and challenges, and there's been a lot of research by well-known companies and universities, and I can summarize that for us rather
Yeah.
quickly here. So what we're finding out is that companies are busy implementing and executing AI at different levels, right? But what they're doing is they're focusing, concentrating on, developing pilots or fragmented implementations of AI across the enterprise, but they really don't have an enterprise-wide strategy of how they're going to implement it and what they're going to implement first, second, and third, how are they going to update their processes and so forth. So the whole notion there is you've probably read this, it's about piloting and experimenting and not getting anything operationalized, right?
Yeah.
So that's number one. Then we also hear, and I've heard this for years, I don't know if you had, Aaron, business value is difficult to define and
Yeah.
measure. I mean, value, how do I measure value, right? And generally, as a product manager or the business leader is responsible for that, right? To determine and define the value and measure it. What's interesting is right now, after years of doing this, and people, using OKRs, objectives and key results is the latest framework, right? Only 39% of companies report that they actually measure any value that's meaningful
Mhm.
to their company, right? The other one is that on the AI side, and I understand why, the number one value we wanted to measure was productivity. So if I implement this agent or do Gen AI or whatever, is that going to improve the productivity of my workforce? Hopefully without laying off your workforce,
Yeah.
right? And so they are measuring that, but it's an efficiency improvement, and that's good, but they're not really totaling it up across the enterprise and
Mhm.
across the company and making those decisions, right?
Yeah.
Then what we're finding out now is it's a good thing and it's not so good, is that everyone's just going and implementing AI in their different functional areas. And they're as we've said, autonomy is good. You can make certain decisions, which is good, but now you end up with what we call fragmented AI solutions across the enterprise and the company. Like in the old days when we wrote code, used to call it spaghetti code. We had spaghetti architectures and so forth. It's similar now. So now they're spreading out their investments across these organizations, and they're not accumulating to see, okay, how did that impact operational cost or revenue or so forth, right?
Yeah.
And then the other thing we're finding out is everyone's quickly doing this and moving fast. They're not getting their finance department involved at the beginning.
Mhm.
So if I'm going to measure value and be able to hook that back to my general ledger or my revenue, my operational costs, or other values that you're going to measure for your company, I think you need the finance department to be involved and help you to do that so that you can see it and measure it and have dashboards and so forth, and then determine what to do if you don't hit the value that you expected.
Yeah. It's a good idea up front to get the finance folks involved so that we know how we're going to count the beans on this thing, right?
Mhm.
Rather than after the fact trying to piece it together. So yeah, that's as you said, that's a lot of what we've been dealing with in the agile world for a long time. Where product owners, we always encourage them to try to figure out some way to measure the value of what you're doing, so you can better prioritize that, better understand it. Are we having an impact? And a lot of that is baselining up front. And if
Mhm.
you do that, then you know what you're baselining, what metric we're looking at, what needle we're trying to move, so that when we actually start doing things, we can tell, did it move? Did it move as far as we wanted it to? That kind of stuff. But if you don't do that up front, then we're just kind of guessing at best. And sometimes it's just sort of, well, it's a gut feel. We feel like we're doing the right thing and it might be going the right direction, but no one can tell, right?
Right.
Tough.
Yeah, and it should be aligned to your strategic goals and targets for the company, right? And
Yeah.
there's some things we're going to experiment and innovate on where we don't know yet what the value is. We can have a hypothesis, right? And then measure the outcome and everything and see if we want to continue doing that experiment or that innovation lab result, right? But I think, managing and creating a culture of value helps with the company. Now when they start saying, well, we're going to be AI native, when we think of a solution or solve a particular challenge or problem, our first thought is, okay, well, can AI help me here?
Hmm.
Okay. And then what's the value it's going to help produce, right? And then how do I measure it and instrument it? That's the hard thing for many companies. Like, well, we think we're going to create this value, increase revenue, or lower this operational cost by X% here. Cool. How are you going to instrument that and measure it,
Hmm. Yeah.
right?
Yeah, and it comes back to when they talk about experimenting. Well, experiment, you usually start with a hypothesis. Here's what we think is going to happen, and then let's prove or disprove, right?
Right.
Most people, when they say experiment, what they really mean is just go do a bunch of stuff, right?
Exactly.
That's not an
Exactly.
experiment. That's doing a bunch of stuff. And so,
Exactly.
if you're going to try to measure value and have that culture of measuring value, then you really have to think about it as a true experiment. You got to lay down, okay, here's what we're actually going to try to test. Here's what the metric is we're shooting for. Here's the bar we need to meet to know if it's successful or not, right? That's an experiment. And if you're not
Right.
doing that, you're not really experimenting. You might be doing interesting stuff, but it's not an experiment, right?
Right. And eventually, hopefully a lot of your experiments end up being production ready, operationalized,
Mm-hmm.
uh, products
Yeah,
or services or platforms,
yeah,
right? That continuously create and produce value for you,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And same thing with redefining your processes, your work processes, your workflows, right? Your
Mm-hmm.
value stream.
Yeah.
So that's important. I think I'm also seeing out there is that some organizations are intentional in taking this more serious, right? So there's some organizations that are creating organizational structures and they're kind of doing what we did in the past, the PMO, the product or project management office or the enterprise product manager office or program manager office. And they're having kind of like a value organization that would measure the value and report it up to the C-suite and then gather all the data. Now you can use AI agents to gather all that data, produce the dashboards and so forth. So some companies are doing pretty well that, and they have governance councils and so forth to do this. So I think we might see more of that
Mm-hmm.
as we progress in our AI journey, AI helping us doing that and then measuring and instrumenting the value, but also a team that's responsible
Mm-hmm.
for gathering that data, that information, and reporting on it, and then having the
Yeah.
right people and then make decisions based on do we make it or not.
Yeah, and that's a good way to think about it too. Is something we promote a lot in our leadership classes about, guiding organizational change and things like that. If you want to get serious about things, there are different levers to pull in that
Mhm.
systematic layer of the organization. And so one thing we talk about as an exercise in one of our classes is try to differentiate between like the degrees of how much do you really mean it that you want to make
Right,
change. If you want to make a little bit of change, put a metric to it, right, and start
right,
measuring value. Like have a way to measure value. The next thing is to put a policy in place to say how we're going to do that, and then there's rules around it and governance and
mhm,
things like that. But the most effective one, the one that really means you mean it the most, is that you have a structure like a team, right? That's
right,
responsible for making sure that it happens, or to monitor it or police it or whatever. But it's sort of those degrees of how much do you mean it? Measure it, have a rule, or have a team. That means the most. And if you have that, if you go to that degree that we're really, trying to implement a culture of value, then you've got something like that to really guide and inform as an organizational structure that we really do mean that we were going to be a culture of value, and that the things we do should matter and they should align to our strategic goals and all that kind of stuff. So that's
right,
from a leadership standpoint something to really take seriously about how much do you mean it, which lever do you want to pull. Yeah.
right. And we all know that, I was talking about financial value, but there's other values too, right? There's
Right.
employee value, there's customer value, and so forth.
Yeah.
And you need to measure all those, right, to determine where you're at and where you want to go based on your goals and targets, right? So I do like the notion of a value office or something like that, But I was thinking, I was thinking, a perfect place to put value office or value leadership team would be in the finance department under the CFO,
Makes sense.
right? Right. And then they could measure that and report out on it and so forth. And then they would also help, spread the good word of how to create a value culture.
Yeah. Yeah, helps everyone look at the scoreboard in the same way, that we all understand
Mhm.
what those points mean in the same way. And so
Mhm.
having that be in the finance department probably makes a whole lot of sense. So we are counting the beans all the same way in terms of what
Right.
that potential value means, whether it is
Mhm.
through financial value like direct revenue that we're creating or saving, or
Mhm.
if it's other things like productivity. We should have an understanding of how we're going to measure that, what the calculation would be, so that's
Right.
commonly understood, things like that. And that's
Yeah.
probably a good place to put it, is under finance. So a
Yeah.
lot of these things we talk about with agile and AI come back to well beyond the technology into the business, and that's a good example of it right there.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I think, like we kept saying, this is a business and a workforce transformation, right?
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
technology is just an enabler,
Yeah,
right?
for
AI
sure.
is an enabler. So one thing, I know some people would um, like to have their own value office, because if you think about HR, your workforce, if you think about the technology operations COO, right? So even though I said a good place would be under CFO, but I'm sure these other leaders would may disagree with me.
Yeah. Yeah. It's possible. I mean, and it's, partly back to that culture aspect, like what kind of a culture do you want to have? If it is like truly raw numbers and you're, in the finance world and, insurance and banking and all that kind of stuff, then it might make perfect sense to have it there. There could be other, industries where it would make more sense to be under HR, right? Or something like
Right.
that, where it's, the value to us is more about the people impact, or,
Mhm.
the cultural and social aspects of the organization, to make
Mhm.
sure that we're all able to work together well and things like that. So there's different, probably some different
Mhm.
arguments about where exactly that could go, or it could be something that straddles as a horizontal function, like a lot of things,
Mhm.
right? So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's interesting. As you think about culture, it's people think a lot about AI as just the technology part of it and the tools and all the fun stuff, but it really does come back to being a business aspect of business transformation, especially when we think about how does it impact culture and what do we want our culture to be around how
Right.
we deal with and think about AI. So
Right.
that's good stuff. Well, thanks, Jay. Appreciate those insights, and I know you do a great job of keeping up with the research, much better than I do. So it's always great to hear from you on those things. So with
Cool.
that, that's our episode for today. But next one to look ahead to is strategy over execution of AI.
Yeah.
So we'll talk about that next time. And with that,
Yeah.
we'll see you
Yep.
all next time.
Yep. Bye-bye. Hi. Thanks for listening. Make sure you like and subscribe so you don't miss any upcoming episodes. And drop a comment with topics or questions you'd like us to cover. Thank you. See you later.